"The best gift is when you're gone," my grandson said, and no one at the table told him he was wrong. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They just sat there between the plates and glasses, as real and solid as the roast I had spent all afternoon preparing. I remember the way Ethan leaned back in his chair after saying it, like he had just delivered a clever joke. He even smiled a little. 19 years old, tall, confident, wearing the watch I bought him for his high school graduation. I had wrapped it myself, silver paper, neat corners. He didn't look at me after he said it. He looked at his father instead. Daniel didn't say anything. He reached for his water glass, took a sip, and stared down at the table. Laura, my daughter-in-law, adjusted her napkin and let out a soft breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but not quite. It was small, controlled, the kind of sound you make when you don't want to be noticed, but you're not entirely unhappy either. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I didn't move. I didn't ask him what he meant. Because the truth is, I understood exactly what he meant. The room was warm, filled with the smell of rosemary and butter, the kind of dinner that used to make this family linger for hours. I had set the table with my best china, the one I only brought out for holidays. Christmas lights blinked softly along the window. It should have felt like home. It didn't. It felt staged. Like everyone was playing a role they had rehearsed long before I walked into the room. I looked at Ethan again. He was already reaching for his phone, scrolling, detached, as if he hadn't just said something that should have stopped everything. But nothing stopped. Plates shifted. Silverware clinked. Life moved on in that quiet, polite way people use when they've agreed not to see something. That was the moment I realized something far more unsettling than the words themselves. This wasn't new. Cruelty like that doesn't appear out of nowhere. It grows. It's repeated. It's learned. Children don't invent those sentences. They borrow them. I let my eyes drift across the table, slow and careful. Daniel still wouldn't look at me. Laura finally did, just for a second. Her expression was calm, too calm. Then she gave me a small, almost sympathetic smile, the kind you offer a stranger, not family. I returned it, because I have always believed in keeping things graceful, even when they are not deserved. That's quite a thing to say. I replied softly, my voice steady, almost gentle. Ethan shrugged without looking up. Just being honest, he muttered. Honest. I nodded once, as if I were considering it, as if I were weighing his words like they had any innocence left in them. But inside, something quiet and certain began to take shape. Not anger, not even hurt, just clarity. I picked up my fork and took a small bite, tasting nothing. Around me, the conversation slowly resumed, cautious at first, then more natural, as if the moment had passed. But it hadn't. Not for me. Because in that single sentence, I had been given something rare. Not a gift, not really. A truth. Clear, undeniable, and long overdue. And I have learned, over the years, that once you see the truth, you don't argue with it. You don't fight it. You simply decide what to do next. The rest of the dinner passed in a way that would have looked perfectly normal to anyone standing outside the window. That was the unsettling part. Nothing dramatic happened. No raised voices. No apologies. Just the quiet rhythm of a family finishing a meal together, as if nothing had shifted, as if a line had not just been crossed in plain sight. I cleared my plate slowly, careful not to rush, careful not to draw attention. The fork touched the porcelain with a soft, deliberate sound. I have always believed that small sounds reveal more than loud ones. Daniel began talking about work, something about a new contract, numbers and deadlines that filled the space where silence might have forced someone to think. Laura nodded at the right moments, asking questions that sounded supportive, practiced. Ethan laughed at something on his phone, a short, sharp laugh that had nothing to do with any of us. I watched them all the way one watches a scene they have seen before, but never fully understood. And then, piece by piece, it began to settle into place. There had been other moments. Smaller ones. Easier to dismiss at the time. A conversation that stopped when I entered the room. A decision. About the house that I heard about after it had already been made. The way Laura had once said, very lightly, that it might be easier if I did not worry myself with certain details anymore. I had smiled then too. I had told myself it was kindness. That they were trying to protect me from stress. But kindness does not erase someone. It does not move them quietly to the edge of their own life. I reached for the serving dish and began to clear the table. You do not have to do that, Laura said, her voice gentle, almost warm. She did not stand to help. I do not mind, I replied. And I did not. Not really. The act of clearing gave me something to do with my hands while my mind moved somewhere else entirely. Ethan stood up before anyone else, muttering that he had plans. He did not look at me as he walked past. The chair scraped softly against the floor, then settled back into place once he was gone. I listened to his footsteps fade down the hallway, then the front door opening, closing. Gone. The word lingered longer than it should have. Daniel finally pushed his chair back and stretched, glancing at Laura before looking at me. Dinner was good, Mom, he said. Polite. Distant. Like a line he had learned and repeated out of habit. Thank you, I answered. I meant it. I have always appreciated honesty, even when it is incomplete. They moved into the living room, turning on the television, letting the soft glow and background noise fill whatever space remained. I stayed in the kitchen, rinsing plates under warm water, watching the steam rise and disappear. It struck me then, not suddenly, but with a quiet certainty, that nothing I had heard that evening was accidental. Words like that do not slip out. They settle in a person first. They are repeated, shaped, made comfortable. And then, one day, they are spoken without hesitation. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands slowly, pressing the towel against my palms as if grounding myself in something real. In the other room, Laura laughed at something on the screen. Daniel joined her a second later. It sounded easy, natural, as if the world was exactly as they wanted it to be. I stepped into the doorway and watched them. For a moment, they did not notice. Or perhaps they did, and chose not to show it. Either way, it did not matter. Because for the first time, I was not wondering how to fix what I felt. I was not searching for an explanation that would make it smaller, more manageable. I was simply observing. And once you begin to observe without needing to belong, everything becomes clearer than you ever expected. That night, after the television was turned off and the house settled into its usual quiet, I did not go to bed right away. I have lived long enough to know that certain moments deserve to be sat with, not rushed past. I turned off the kitchen lights one by one, leaving only the small lamp by the window glowing softly against the dark. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second measured, indifferent. I stood there for a while, listening. The house sounded the same as it always had. Pipes shifting, floorboards settling, the low hum of the refrigerator. Familiar sounds that once brought comfort. Now they simply existed, like everything else. I walked slowly down the hallway, passing the framed photographs that lined the wall. Daniel as a boy, missing his front teeth, grinning up at me with that open, unguarded joy children carry before the world teaches them otherwise. Ethan as a toddler, sitting on my lap, holding a wooden train set I had spent hours assembling on a Sunday afternoon. I paused in front of that picture longer than the others. His small hand rested on mine, trusting without question. Children do not come into the world with distance in their eyes. That is something they are given over time. I continued into my bedroom and sat at the edge of the bed without turning on the light. The moon cast a pale glow through the curtains, just enough to see the outlines of things. My dresser, the chair by the corner, the quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed. Everything in its place. I have always believed in order. In taking care of what you have been given. I reached into the drawer of my nightstand and took out a small stack of documents I had not looked at in years. Old records, bank statements, the deed to the house, papers that told a story no one in that living room had acknowledged in a very long time. I flipped through them slowly, the pages soft with age, edges slightly worn. There it was in plain ink. The down payment I had made on this house nearly 20 years ago when Daniel said he needed help starting over. The tuition checks for Ethan's private school, signed and mailed without hesitation because I believed in giving him opportunities one never had. Receipts for repairs, for renovations, for things that quietly built the life they now move through as if it had always belonged to them. I placed the papers back in the drawer and closed it gently. No anger followed. No rush of emotion demanding to be released. Just a quiet alignment between what I had known and what I could no longer ignore. Earlier that evening, I had heard laughter in the next room, easy and untroubled. I had seen the way my presence no longer shaped the space, how it barely altered the air at all. That kind of absence does not happen overnight. It is practiced. It is accepted. And eventually, it is expected. I lay back against the pillows, staring up at the ceiling, tracing the faint cracks in the paint that had formed over the years. Time leaves marks on everything. Walls, hands, relationships. Some people notice them and repair them. Others learn to live around them until the structure itself changes. I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to think without distraction. Ethan's voice returned, clear, unhesitating. The words themselves were simple, direct, but what mattered was not how they sounded. It was where they came from. And for the first time, I allowed myself to follow that thought all the way through, without softening it, without stopping halfway to protect something that no longer existed. When I finally opened my eyes again, the room felt different. Not warmer, not colder, just clearer, like looking through glass that had been cleaned after years of dust. I turned onto my side and pulled the blanket over me, settling into the quiet with a sense of calm I had not expected. Because once you understand that you have already been moved out of a place, emotionally, quietly, without announcement, the question is no longer how to stay. The question becomes something else entirely. And I had a feeling I already knew the answer. I woke before the sun the next morning, not because I had to, but because my mind had already finished its work sometime in the night. There was a stillness to the house that felt almost unfamiliar, as if it belonged to someone else now, someone who no longer expected anything from the people inside it. I sat up slowly, letting my feet rest on the floor, grounding myself in the quiet certainty that had replaced the confusion of the day before. There was no rush, no urgency, just a sequence of steps I already understood. I dressed in the same way I always had, choosing simple clothes, pressing the fabric smooth with my hands, making sure every detail was in place. Habit has a way of holding a person together when everything else begins to shift. In the kitchen, I made coffee and poured it into my favorite cup, the one with the small chip on the rim that I had never bothered to replace. I stood by the window and watched the early light stretch across the yard, pale and slow, touching the edges of the fence, the tree Daniel had planted years ago when he still asked for my opinion on where it should go. I remembered how he had stood beside me then, waiting for my answer, trusting it. That memory did not hurt. It simply existed, separate from who he had become. I took a sip of coffee and set the cup down carefully, already knowing what needed to be done next. By the time the rest of the house began to wake, I was ready. Laura came into the kitchen first, her hair pulled back loosely, her expression neutral but alert in that quiet way she carried. She paused when she saw me dressed, standing by the counter with my purse already in my hand. "You are up early," she said, her tone light, almost casual. I nodded once. "I have a few things to take care of this morning," I replied. She studied me for a second longer than necessary, as if trying to place something she could not quite name. Then she smiled, polite, contained. "Let me know if you need anything," she said, already turning away before I could answer. I watched her leave, her footsteps soft against the floor, and I understood something then with even greater clarity. She did not ask where I was going. She did not ask what I needed to take care of. Not because she trusted me, but because it did not occur to her that it mattered. Daniel appeared a few minutes later, moving more slowly, glancing at his phone as he walked in. "Morning, Mom," he said, not looking up. "Morning," I answered. He opened the refrigerator, scanned its contents, then closed it again without taking anything. "I have an early meeting," he added, as if explaining his distance before I could question it. I simply nodded. Of course. There was a time when I would have asked more. Where he was going. What the meeting was about. Whether he had eaten. That time had passed without announcement, just like everything else. I picked up my purse and slipped it over my shoulder. "I will be out for a while," I said, my voice even, unremarkable. He gave a small nod, already halfway out of the room himself. "Okay," he replied. No hesitation. No curiosity. Just acceptance. I stepped outside into the crisp morning air and closed the door behind me, listening as the latch settled into place with a soft click. The driveway stretched out in front of me, empty except for my car, exactly where I had left it the night before. I walked toward it without looking back. There was nothing behind me that required one last glance, no final check to see if someone might call my name. I had already learned the answer to that question. As I started the engine, the sound filled the quiet street, steady and familiar. I placed my hands on the steering wheel and paused for a moment, not out of doubt, but out of recognition. This was the first step that would not be undone, not explained away, not softened for anyone else's comfort. I pulled out of the driveway and drove down the street at a calm, measured pace. The houses passing by one after another, each one holding its own version of a story no one outside could fully see. Mine was no different. The difference was that I was no longer pretending not to understand it. And once you reach that point, the rest becomes surprisingly simple. I did not drive aimlessly. I have never believed in wandering when a decision has already been made. The road to the office was one I had taken before, years ago, when everything was still being arranged, when signatures felt like beginnings instead of conclusions. The building looked the same as I remembered. Clean lines, neutral colors, a place designed to hold other people's decisions without emotion. I parked in the same row I always preferred, close enough to walk without hurry, far enough to avoid unnecessary attention. Inside, the air was cool and still, carrying that faint scent of paper and polished wood that always made everything feel final. The receptionist looked up as I approached, her expression polite, professional. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," I replied, offering my name without hesitation. She recognized it immediately, something shifting slightly in her posture, a subtle acknowledgement of familiarity. "Of course, Mrs. Whitmore. He is expecting you." I nodded once and followed the quiet hallway she indicated, my footsteps measured, steady, echoing softly against the floor. Nothing about this place encouraged second thoughts. The office door was open when I arrived. Robert Jenkins stood as I entered, his manner calm, respectful in a way that did not feel forced. He had handled my affairs before, years ago, when Daniel needed help and I had made arrangements without question. "Margaret," he said, extending his hand. "It has been a while." "It has," I agreed, taking the seat across from his desk without needing to be asked. There was no small talk beyond that. He understood the kind of visit this was the moment he saw my expression. People in his profession learn to read silence as clearly as words. "What would you like to review today?" he asked, folding his hands neatly in front of him. I reached into my purse and placed the folder on his desk, sliding it toward him with a quiet certainty. "Everything," I said. He opened it carefully, scanning the documents, his eyes moving with practiced precision. The will, the property records, the accounts that had been built slowly, deliberately, over a lifetime of choices that had always considered someone else first. He did not interrupt. He did not rush. When he finally looked up, there was no surprise in his expression, only a measured understanding. "Are you certain you would like to make changes to all designated beneficiaries?" he asked. The question was formal, required, but it carried weight nonetheless. I met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes," I replied. No explanation followed. None was necessary. He nodded once and began outlining the process, his voice steady, outlining each step as if guiding someone through something complicated. But it did not feel complicated. It felt precise, clean. Each name he read aloud, I removed. Daniel Whitmore, Laura Whitmore, Ethan Whitmore. One by one, they were taken off the page, not erased in anger, but released with clarity. There is a difference. He paused briefly after the last name, giving space for reconsideration. I remained still. "And the new beneficiaries?" he asked. I had already decided that as well. I named them calmly, each one chosen not out of spite, but out of intention. Places and people who had never expected anything from me, who had never measured my worth by what I would leave behind. He wrote them down, confirming each detail with careful attention. The room remained quiet except for the sound of pen against paper, a soft, steady rhythm that marked the end of something that had, in truth, ended long before this moment. When the documents were ready, he turned them toward me, indicating where I needed to sign. I picked up the pen and paused for a brief second, not out of doubt, but out of recognition. This was the point where everything shifted from understanding to action. Then I signed my name, clear and steady, exactly as I always had. Margaret Whitmore. No hesitation, no flourish, just finality. He gathered the papers, organizing them with practiced care. "It will be processed immediately," he said. I nodded once, rising from my seat. "Thank you," I replied. As I walked back through the hallway, past the receptionist, out into the daylight, nothing about the world appeared different. Cars moved. People walked. Life continued without pause. But something had been set into motion that would not be undone. And for the first time in a long while, I felt no need to explain myself to anyone at all. I did not go straight home after leaving the office. There was no reason to rush back into a space that no longer required my presence to function. Instead, I drove slowly through streets I had known for decades, past grocery stores where I had once shopped for family dinners, past the small park where Ethan used to run ahead of me with a kind of joy that did not ask for permission. The world had not changed. Only my place in it had. I stopped at a quiet cafe a few blocks away from the main road, the kind of place that did not draw large crowds, where people came to sit alone with their thoughts or their work. I ordered a simple cup of coffee and chose a table near the window, placing my purse carefully on the chair beside me. The glass reflected a faint image of myself, steady, composed, a woman who looked exactly as she had the day before, and yet was no longer carrying the same weight. I wrapped my hands around the warm cup and allowed the silence to settle again, not as something heavy, but as something clear. Around me, there were small conversations, quiet laughter, the soft hum of life continuing in its ordinary way. No one here knew me. No one expected anything from me. And that, I realized, was a kind of freedom I had not experienced in a very long time. I took a slow sip and let my thoughts move without interruption. There had been a time when I would have questioned myself by now, when doubt would have found its way in through small openings, asking if I had acted too quickly, too firmly. But there was no such voice today, because nothing about what I had done felt sudden. It had been building for years, shaped by moments that were easy to overlook when taken alone, but impossible to ignore when seen together. I thought about Daniel, about the boy in the photograph, about the man who now moved through his own home without once wondering if I might need anything. I thought about Laura, about the careful way she chose her words, the way she smiled just enough to appear kind without ever offering anything real. And I thought about Ethan, about how easily he had spoken, how naturally the words had come to him, as if they had always belonged there. I did not blame him, not entirely. Young people repeat what they hear. They learn from what is allowed to exist around them. That did not excuse it, but it explained it. I set the cup down and looked out at the street, watching as a couple walked past, their steps in sync, their conversation light, unguarded. There was a time when I believed that was what family always looked like beneath the surface. I know better now. By the time I returned to my car, the sun was higher, the day fully awake. I drove back toward the house at the same steady pace, not avoiding it, not dreading it, simply acknowledging that it was still a place I would enter, at least for now. When I pulled into the driveway, both Daniel's and Laura's cars were gone. The house stood quiet, exactly as I had left it, unchanged in every visible way. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, listening to the stillness that greeted me. It did not feel empty. It felt settled. I walked through each room without purpose, just observing. The living room, where they had sat the night before, now clean and undisturbed. The kitchen, counters cleared, dishes put away, no trace of the meal that had marked the beginning of something they had not yet realized. I paused for a moment, letting the quiet stretch out around me, and understood that this was the last time I would experience it this way, without interruption, without explanation. I did not need to rehearse what would come next. I did not need to prepare words or arguments. Everything that needed to be done had already been set into motion. All that remained was time. And time, I have learned, has a way of revealing things with a precision no one can control. They returned later that afternoon, one by one, in the same quiet pattern they always had, as if the house itself guided their movements without requiring thought. I heard the front door open while I was sitting in the living room, the sound familiar, almost routine. Laura came in first, her heels soft against the floor, her keys placed carefully on the table by the door. She paused when she saw me already there, seated, composed, my hands resting lightly in my lap. "You are back," she said, her tone neutral, but her eyes searching for something just beneath the surface. I nodded once. "I have been for a while," I replied. She studied me for a moment longer than necessary, then gave a small, controlled smile before moving past me into the kitchen. No questions, no curiosity, just the same quiet distance that had settled into everything. Daniel arrived shortly after, his presence announced by the low sound of his voice on the phone before he even stepped inside. He finished his conversation as he walked through the door, speaking about numbers, timelines, things that filled space but revealed nothing. When he saw me, he gave a brief nod, an acknowledgement more than a greeting. "Hey, Mom," he said, already loosening his tie, already turning his attention elsewhere. "Hello, Daniel," I answered, my voice steady, unremarkable. Ethan did not come home until later, the sky already dimming, the house shifting into that quiet evening rhythm once again. He walked in with the same casual energy he always carried, dropping his bag near the door, glancing briefly in my direction before looking away. "Hey," he said, not stopping, not waiting. "Good evening," I replied. He disappeared down the hallway without another word. I listened to his footsteps fade, just as I had the night before, and noticed how little impact it had this time. There was a calmness to it now, a distance that no longer felt sharp. We gathered for dinner again, not because it had been planned, but because routine has a way of pulling people back into the same spaces, even when nothing about them feels the same. I set the table as I always did, each plate placed with care, each glass aligned just so. No one commented. No one ever had. They sat down one by one, taking their usual places, the arrangement unchanged, as if preserving the appearance of something that had already shifted beyond recognition. Conversation moved lightly at first, surface level, safe. Work, weather, small details that required no investment. I listened, responding when necessary, my words measured, simple. There was no tension in my voice, no trace of what had been decided earlier that day. That was the part they would not see coming. At one point, Laura mentioned a future plan, something about renovations, about updating parts of the house to make it more functional. She spoke with quiet confidence, as if the future she described was already secured, already hers to shape. Daniel agreed, nodding, adding details, speaking in that same practical tone he used for everything. Ethan barely looked up, offering short responses when spoken to, his attention divided, his presence partial. I watched them all, not with judgment, not with resentment, but with a kind of clarity that made everything feel almost distant. They spoke about the future as if it belonged to them, as if it had already been decided, as if nothing could alter the path they had quietly accepted. I took a sip of water and set the glass down carefully, the sound soft against the table. No one noticed. Or if they did not consider it important. That, more than anything, confirmed what I had already understood. When dinner ended, they moved away from the table in the same easy manner, leaving dishes behind, conversations unfinished, attention already shifting to something else. I remained seated for a moment longer, letting the quiet settle once again. There was no need to rush, no need to follow, because for the first time, I was no longer part of what came next for them. And they did not yet realize that they were no longer part of what came next for me. The next morning unfolded with a quiet precision that felt almost deliberate, as if time itself had decided to move carefully, giving everything the exact space it needed. I woke at the same hour, followed the same routine, but there was a difference now in how each moment settled. Nothing felt uncertain. Nothing needed to be interpreted. I moved through the house calmly, making coffee, setting things in place, allowing the familiar motions to carry me forward without distraction. Daniel and Laura left earlier than usual, mentioning something about a meeting they both needed to attend. Their voices were light, coordinated in that subtle way people develop when they have been aligning themselves for a long time. Ethan left shortly after, barely finishing his breakfast, offering a quick goodbye that did not reach the rest of the room. By mid-morning, the house was quiet again. I did not fill the silence. I let it remain exactly as it was, undisturbed. Around noon, my phone rang. The sound cut through the stillness with a clarity that immediately told me what it was. I did not rush to answer. I let it ring once more before picking it up. "Mrs. Whitmore," Robert's voice came through, steady, professional. "Everything has been finalized. All documents are signed, recorded, and effective as of this morning." I closed my eyes briefly, not out of emotion, but to acknowledge the weight of what had just been confirmed. "Thank you," I said simply. "If there is anything further you require, please let me know," he added. "There is not," I replied. And that was the truth. When the call ended, the house felt even quieter, but not empty. Complete. There was nothing left unfinished. No detail left uncertain. I set the phone down on the counter and stood there for a moment, letting the finality settle into place. In the afternoon, I moved through the house one last time, not searching for anything, not holding on to anything, simply observing. The living room, where laughter had once felt genuine. The kitchen, where meals had been prepared with care that no one had noticed in years. The hallway, lined with photographs that now felt like records of a story that had already concluded. I paused briefly at each one, not to dwell, but to recognize. Then I continued. By the time evening approached, I had already decided how it would unfold. When Daniel and Laura returned, their energy was slightly different, lighter in a way that suggested they believed everything ahead was already secured. Ethan followed not long after, his presence filling the space with that same casual detachment. We gathered in the living room this time, not at the table, but in a more relaxed arrangement, as if the formality of dinner was no longer necessary. Laura mentioned plans again, speaking about changes, about updates, about how things would be better once everything was organized properly. Daniel nodded, adding details, building on her words as if they were constructing something that had already been approved. I listened without interruption, my attention steady, my expression unchanged. When there was a pause, a natural break in their conversation, I spoke. I took care of something important yesterday, I said, my voice calm measured. They looked at me then, all three of them, their attention shifting in a way it had not in a long time. Oh, Daniel asked, his tone neutral, but with a trace of curiosity finally appearing. I nodded once. Yes, I continued. I updated my estate documents. The room grew still in a way that felt different from before. This was not avoidance. This was attention. Laura's posture straightened slightly, her eyes focused now, calculating in that quiet, careful way she had. Ethan glanced up from his phone, his expression unreadable, but no longer detached. Daniel leaned forward just enough to show interest, though he tried to keep his tone casual. Updated how, he asked. I met his gaze evenly. I made everything clear, I replied. And then I let the silence do the rest, because sometimes the most powerful moment is not the explanation, but the space that follows it. No one spoke at first. The silence that followed my words was not empty this time. It was full, heavy with understanding that had not yet been shaped into questions. Daniel was the first to move, leaning back slightly, his expression shifting into something more focused, more deliberate. What do you mean by that? He asked, his voice controlled, but no longer casual. Laura did not speak, but her attention sharpened in a way that was impossible to miss. Ethan remained still, his phone lowered now, his eyes moving between us, waiting. I did not rush to answer. I have learned that when people finally listen, you do not need to fill the space too quickly. I reviewed everything. I said, my tone even steady. The house. The accounts. All of it. Daniel nodded slowly, as if that alone explained something. Okay, he replied, though the word carried uncertainty now. And I met his gaze without hesitation. And I made changes, I said. The words were simple. They did not need to be anything more. Laura's hand tightened slightly around the arm of her chair, a small movement, but precise. What kind of changes? She asked, her voice still polite, but no longer relaxed. I folded my hands gently in my lap, the same way I had the night before, the same way I had when everything began to become clear. I removed all previous beneficiaries, I answered. The effect was immediate, though not loud. Daniel's posture shifted forward again, this time without pretense. Removed, he repeated, as if the word itself did not quite settle. Yes, I said. No explanation followed. None was needed. Laura's expression did not break, but something behind it changed, something sharper, more calculated. You mean, temporarily? She asked carefully. I shook my head once. No, I replied. Ethan let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, not quite anything else. So where does it go then? He asked, his tone lighter than the others, but edged with something new, something uncertain. I looked at him for a moment, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with a clarity he had not yet learned to recognize. To people and places that understand its value, I said. Daniel stood up then, slowly, as if movement might help him process what had just been said. Mom, that does not make sense, he began, his voice tightening despite his effort to keep it steady. We are your family. I nodded once. You are, I agreed. That has not changed. He paused, the response not landing where he expected. Then why would you do this? He asked. The question hung in the air, direct, unavoidable. I considered it for a moment, not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted the answer to be exactly as clear as everything else had become. Because I listened, I said finally. The room stilled again, but this time there was no confusion about what that meant. Laura looked away first, her gaze shifting toward the window, as if the answer had confirmed something she had already suspected. Daniel's shoulders lowered slightly, the tension in them changing shape, less defensive now, more uncertain. Ethan did not speak. He simply watched, his earlier confidence gone, replaced by a quiet awareness that something irreversible had just taken place. I rose from my seat slowly, not to leave in a hurry, but to mark the end of something that did not require further discussion. You said something important the other night. I continued, my voice calm, almost gentle. My eyes rested briefly on Ethan before moving back to the room as a whole, and I realized you were right. No one interrupted. No one asked me to explain further. They did not need to. I picked up my purse from the table, holding it lightly at my side. You wanted my absence, I said, not as an accusation, but as a simple acknowledgement. Now you will have it, in the only way that matters. The words settled into the room without resistance, without argument. I walked toward the door at the same measured pace I had carried all day, my steps steady, unhurried. No one stopped me. No one called my name. And as I reached for the handle, I understood that this silence, this complete and undeniable silence, was the clearest answer of all. I opened the door and stepped outside, closing it gently behind me, leaving everything exactly where it had already been. Long before I ever said a word.